Ever get that feeling like when you're online, it's like a digital minefield with all your data.
Yeah.
You're clicking agree, agree, agree 100 times and you don't even know what's happening in the background.
Right.
That's where privacy engineering comes in.
Yeah.
It's like the Secret Service, but for your data.
Yeah.
They make sure all those promises that we see in privacy policies actually become real-world protection.
What I think is so interesting about this is that even, a genius like Einstein, he kind of saw this coming.
Really?
Yeah, he said, if at first the idea is not absurd, then there is no hope for it.
Wow.
And he was talking about physics, I think, when he said that, but
Mhm.
it's kind of relevant to how complicated digital privacy is, don't you think?
It really is. It's mind-boggling when you think about all the data that's out there
Yeah.
about all of us. And you know what? I bet even Einstein would be amazed and maybe a little terrified at how much is out there.
Yeah, for sure.
So to guide our deep dive today,
Mhm.
we're using the Privacy Engineer's Manifesto.
Okay.
And don't worry, this isn't going to be like getting a law degree or anything like that.
Right.
We're just trying to give you the basics, the nuts and bolts, really, of how privacy is actually engineered into all those systems that we use every single day.
Yeah, it's really about bridging that gap between what privacy should be in theory, those like idealistic views of it, and then the actual reality of building software and, having it work.
Right.
So the book introduces this term, privacy engineering. Sounds awfully technical. Is this where we get into the nitty-gritty of how companies should be handling our data?
Exactly. Privacy engineering is about building privacy right into systems and products from the start.
Yeah.
You're making it fundamental, not some afterthought.
And are there actual guidelines or frameworks for that? Because it seems like a lot of different terms get thrown around. GAPT, the EU Data Directive, privacy by design.
Yep.
It gets confusing.
Yeah, but those aren't just buzzwords. These are actual frameworks that organizations can follow, like GAPP that was developed by the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants. And it gives companies these principles for managing privacy risks. And then there's the EU Data Directive, which sets standards for protecting data across Europe. So that impacts any company dealing with data from European citizens, no matter where they're based. And of course, there's privacy by design, which Dr. Ann Cavoukian has really championed. And that focuses on integrating privacy from the very beginning of the design process itself.
So it's like baking it in from the start.
Exactly.
And a good place to start, I think, and the manifesto kind of points this out, is privacy policies.
So how does a privacy policy, even if it's a good one, how does it actually protect my data?
It's kind of like the blueprint, and I don't just mean in a legal sense, but it's like the outline for all the technical stuff, all the processes that have to happen for your data to be handled the right way.
Okay.
So, if a policy says we minimize data collection, well, the engineers need like really specific instructions on how to actually build that into their system.
So like the difference between me saying, hey, I want to build a tree house, and then handing over a blueprint that says how much wood to buy, what kind of wood to buy,
Yeah.
all the safety stuff, where the ladder goes.
Exactly. And just like building a treehouse, you've got different people who care about the treehouse in different ways. So on the one hand, you've got, companies, enterprises, they want to use data to make their products better, or let's be honest, they want to sell you more stuff. And then you've got users like you, and you want your data to be protected.
Right. It's a constant tug of war.
Yeah.
So where does privacy engineering fit into this whole tug of war?
Mhm.
How do we say, okay, we hear you companies, you want to innovate, but hey, users, you have a right to your privacy.
That is the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
I think that's what makes privacy engineering so interesting.
Yeah.
It's about designing those systems that allow the company to innovate and use data, but it's also giving users, like you said, transparency and control over what happens to their information.
Right.
So it's not about getting rid of data altogether. It's more about making sure it's done in an ethical and responsible way.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But how do you actually translate all of this? Like these big ideas like data minimization, which we hear all the time, how did that actually become something real, like a safeguard?
Yeah.
It just seems like a huge leap.
Yeah, you're right. And that's where the engineering part comes in.
Okay.
Let's think about this data minimization idea.
Okay.
Because it is a big principle, right?
Right.
But what does it actually look like,
Yeah.
It means building systems that only collect the bare minimum of data that you need and only for the reason you need it for. And it means that you need a way to securely get rid of that data when you're done with it.
Oh, okay.
And then I think really importantly, you have to train people why they have to follow all these steps
Right.
and how to implement them.
It sounds like a very complicated dance between the technology, the policy, and just human beings.
Yeah.
It really is. And that actually makes me think about like another layer to this whole thing. Right?
Yeah.
The fact that this is all happening in a digital world
Mm-hmm.
where data can travel around the world like instantly, faster than we can even think about it.
Right.
So how do you design a system that works for everybody?
Yeah.
Right? When you have different cultures, different laws.
Yeah.
I mean, different ideas of what privacy even means.
Exactly. That is like one of the biggest challenges in this field.
Yeah.
The Manifesto uses this great example. They talk about employee monitoring laws, and they're like,
Okay.
what might be totally fine in Finland, like you could get sued in the US for doing that. So if you're trying to build a system that works globally,
Yeah.
it's like, how do you even account for all those different things?
It's like trying to plug in,
Yeah.
to a million different outlets all shaped differently, and they keep changing shape all the time.
Right.
How do you, as a company, I mean, do you just go the strictest regulations then?
I mean, it seems easier, right?
Yeah.
Just go to the most strict and follow that everywhere, but
Yeah.
it doesn't really help anyone, right?
Yeah.
It kind of stifles innovation, and it might not even be what different cultures and places want, right?
Right.
So a better approach, and this is something the Manifesto talks about, is to build on those principles, those globally recognized ones.
Okay.
Like you've got guidelines from the OECD,
Okay.
the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. They have some, or those generally accepted privacy principles,
Yeah.
GAPP, we call them.
Yeah.
And these are kind of like the baseline globally for how you handle data the right way.
So instead of this one-size-fits-all approach, it's almost like it's like a modular design.
Yeah.
You have the core stuff,
Yeah.
but then you can adjust based on where you are. Like,
Exactly. It's like building a house.
Okay.
You've got a foundation.
right.
You've got walls and a roof.
Mhm.
Those are your core principles.
Right.
But then, like, depending on where you are, you're going to make changes, right?
Right.
If it's a cold climate, you're going to add insulation, or
Right.
you're going to have to follow the local building codes, right?
Right. So if a company's operating in Europe, they might have one module,
Right.
and if they're in California, maybe it's slightly different.
Yeah, exactly. That's a really good way to put it. And this is where I think it becomes really important to work with
Yeah.
the legal teams and the tech teams. They've got to work together.
And speaking of that,
Yeah.
the Manifesto talks about this, like this relationship that lawyers and engineers have when it comes to privacy
Right.
and how it can be a little bit
Yeah. Rocky.
rocket. Yeah, exactly. And you think they'd be on the same side, right? Like, come on, guys, we're trying to protect everybody here.
You'd think so, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
But they don't always see eye to eye.
No.
Like lawyers, they really care about the language, right?
Right.
Making sure every word is exactly right.
Right.
Because that's what they do. They're thinking about regulations, and they're thinking about, oh, how could somebody get around this?
Right. All the loopholes.
Yes.
You know.
And engineers are like, well, how do we actually build this thing?
Right. How do we actually make this work in the real world?
Exactly.
So it's like the lawyer saying, okay, make sure every I is dotted and every T is crossed or else we're going to get sued.
Yeah.
And the engineer's like, yeah, but can we do that and still have the internet work?
Right. Can we even build this?
Yeah.
And the Manifesto had this really funny example about the word reasonable.
Oh, okay.
You see it everywhere in privacy, right?
Right.
Like HIPAA, for example, right? That's all about your medical data. And they use this word reasonable all the time, right?
Okay.
And to a lawyer, reasonable, that's good, that's flexible. Yeah.
But for an engineer, it's terrible.
What is reasonable?
Yeah, exactly. They need like, what are the parameters?
Right. Like how much flour is reasonable? Like give me a number.
It's like a recipe that says bake it for a reasonable amount of time.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's why these two, they've got to find a way to communicate.
Right.
Because you need the lawyers
Yeah.
to make sure everything is compliant.
Right.
But you also need the engineers to build something that works.
Right. So it's almost like you need a translator
Yes, exactly.
who speaks both lawyer and engineer.
Yes. And when that happens, you can get really cool stuff.
Yeah.
Things that are innovative, but also respect people's privacy.
It's interesting how much of this we keep coming back to, like, boils down to just how we communicate with each other. It really does, right?
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about the how of this whole privacy engineering thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm curious about the future, right?
Oh, yeah.
This feels like a really new field, something that's like constantly changing and evolving.
It's very dynamic.
So what do you think the future of privacy engineering is? What are you most excited about?
I think for a long time, we were stuck reacting to privacy problems.
Yeah.
Like something would happen and it would be like, oh no, how do we fix that?
Right.
But I think what I'm most excited about is that we're starting to like Build privacy in from the beginning.
So instead of trying to, frost a cake that's already baked,
Mhm.
you're thinking about the ingredients while you're making it.
That is a really good analogy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Because it's not just about checking boxes anymore. Companies are realizing that when you respect people's privacy,
Mm-hmm.
it's actually good for business.
Because people trust you more.
Yeah. They're more likely to use your product.
You're right. Okay.
They're going to be happier with you. The book uses this term use cases, right? Is that where the rubber meets the road?
Yes. Think of use cases like scenarios, helping us imagine how to apply these privacy principles in real-world situations. Like, say you're designing one of those popular running apps.
Right. Everyone's using them.
It needs to track data to be useful.
Mm.
But how do you provide a great user experience while still protecting privacy?
Yeah, because I'm sure runners want to see their pace and distance, but probably don't want every step shared with the world.
Exactly. And thinking through use cases forces you to ask, what data do we really need?
Hmm.
Who gets to see this data?
Yeah.
And how long should we even keep this data around? The book emphasizes minimizing data collection, making sure things are clear to users, and giving them control over their own information.
It's less about the tech and more about basic respect, you know? Speaking of real-world stuff, does the book mention specific companies? Not just theoretical apps, but like, how are the big companies actually handling this? I'd love to know.
It does, and it's not just tech companies. For example, Intuit, the financial software company. They're behind TurboTax.
Sure, sure.
And they've actually built a tool that guides their engineers on using data ethically.
So they're walking the walk. What I find interesting is that it sounds like this tool helps bake privacy right into the development process.
Exactly. So imagine an engineer at Intuit is working on a new feature, right? This tool pops up with questions.
Yeah.
What data are you using? Why? Where'd you even get this data? It guides them through those privacy considerations.
It's like a built-in ethical guide.
Right. And it even gives them concrete best practices for being transparent and giving users control, drawing on both internal examples from Intuit and external ones too.
That's interesting. So it's not just, here are some vague guidelines, figure it out. It sounds really practical.
And it's not just Intuit. They talk about vacation planning websites too. Those are full of personal and financial data.
Oh, for sure. That's a ton of data to handle. You've got customer names, payment info, maybe even data from those third-party airlines or hotels. It's a lot. So how do they even begin to approach privacy in that kind of setup?
The book stresses that they need to be looking at the entire life cycle of that data, right? From when you start browsing for a trip to when you're back home.
Makes sense.
Like understanding what data is collected at each point, who has access, how is it protected?
So, for example, when I'm plugging in my credit card info to book that awesome vacation, the website should only be collecting what it absolutely needs, right?
Absolutely. And not just that. They need to have really strong security measures in place, so things like encryption and strict access controls, to keep
Yeah.
that financial information safe. And just as importantly, they need to be upfront with users about how that data is being protected at each step.
It makes you really think twice about which sites you trust.
Yeah, it does. Building and maintaining that trust is crucial. And it's not enough for companies to just, slap a privacy policy on their website and call it good.
Huh.
The book talks about something called a privacy impact assessment, too.
Yeah, so it's like a health check, right? They actually go through a process to figure out what the privacy risks might be early on and how to reduce those risks.
It's evaluating and improving how data is handled.
Hmm.
And that's so important in the tech world because things are constantly changing, right?
Always evolving.
Exactly. And they emphasize that it's not a one-time thing. It's about building a culture of privacy in the whole organization.
So it's bigger than just the tech itself. It's about the people and like creating that privacy-ready culture from top to bottom.
Exactly. Everyone from the CEO down to the interns needs to be on board when it comes to those privacy goals. That means things like clear communication, regular training, making sure everyone's on the same page about privacy.
Even down to those bring your own device policies. Because honestly, that always seemed like a recipe for disaster to me. How can companies control what happens on my personal phone?
Right, DYOD, it's definitely a huge challenge. The book talks about striking that balance, though, between giving employees that flexibility while also making sure that company data stays secure. So things like having those clear guidelines for device use, maybe implementing what they call mobile device management solutions.
Mobile device management? Okay. What does that even mean?
So that can be all sorts of technologies and policies. But basically, it gives IT departments a little bit more control over how those personal devices are accessing company data. One example is something called containerization. It's like creating a separate little space on your phone just for work stuff.
Oh, interesting. So it's like my work emails and files are in this little locked box, separate from my personal apps.
Exactly. And there's also data encryption, so that
Mm.
even if someone did get hold of your phone, they couldn't get into that sensitive company info. But it's not just about the tech. They also talk about making sure employees understand their responsibilities, for keeping company data safe.
So it's both the technology to protect things and making sure people are aware and making smart choices.
That makes sense. Now, one thing the book kept coming back to that I found really interesting was this idea of putting a value on data. And not just for companies, but for us, like for individuals.
Right. Because it's easy to forget that our data actually has value.
It does. But how do you even begin to put a price on something like that? It's not like it's a physical thing you can hold in your hand.
It is tricky. And the book looks at different approaches. Some are more traditional, like looking at the cost, while others are more about things like brand value or what kind of damage a data breach to do to a company's reputation
So you have to factor in those potential risks too.
and the potential rewards. The book talks about how data, just like money in the bank, can gain or lose value over time.
Like an investment. Exactly. And that means companies need to have smart strategies for managing those data assets.
It's like that saying, data is the new oil.
Exactly. It needs to be refined and used strategically.
Yeah.
And speaking of using data strategically, the book talks about Facebook in the early days. They actually used privacy as a selling point.
Oh, wow. That seems a little ironic now. Facebook and privacy, those two don't exactly go hand in hand these days.
It's true.
How did they manage to pull that off?
So think back to the early 2000s when Facebook was just for college students. Their whole thing was trust.
Okay.
Their privacy settings were way stricter, giving users much more control over who saw their stuff.
So they were targeting an audience that already cared about privacy.
Exactly. College students, they were used to sharing within a specific group. And Facebook's initial settings mirrored that. It helped them build a reputation for being more privacy-focused than some of those other social media sites popping up back then.
It's amazing how things have changed. So what happened? Why did they shift away from that initial focus on privacy?
Well, as Facebook grew beyond just college campuses, the pressure to make money, it grew too. That's when you started to see them rolling out all those features and advertising models that relied heavily on collecting and analyzing user data.
So those initial privacy safeguards, they started to fade away.
Right. And it really highlights the tension that's at the heart of this whole debate, balancing innovation with those potential risks to our privacy.
It's a tough balance to strike.
It really is. It forces us to think about those trade-offs we're comfortable making. How much are we willing to share for those personalized experiences?
So, big picture time, where does this all leave us? It's easy to feel overwhelmed by this whole data privacy thing,
It can feel like a lot. That's why it's so important to understand those core principles, right? And how those actually play out in the real world so we can navigate this digital landscape without feeling powerless.
So it's more than just like knowing the rules of the game. It's about understanding how those rules were even made.
Yes, and who gets to make them. And the book reminds us that this isn't just on individuals to figure out alone. Governments and even industry self-regulation, they play a huge role in creating a more privacy-conscious world. Like those frameworks we talked about, the OECD guidelines, GAPP, privacy by design, those give companies real steps they can take to handle our data responsibly.
It's like we all have a part to play.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's encouraging. But honestly, it often feels like an uphill battle.
It can, but the book lays out a good roadmap for getting there. Clear communication is key.
Right.
Transparency and accountability. Ultimately, it's about rebuilding trust. Trust between people and the companies that are using their data.
And speaking of trust, the book really digs into data security as a fundamental part of privacy.
They go hand in hand, don't they? Can't have one without the other. Strong passwords aren't enough anymore. We need companies to be using things like encryption, to scramble our data so it's unreadable without the right keys.
Right.
And access controls to limit who can even see our information. And just as crucial, having a solid plan for what happens if a breach does occur.
Because these days, it's not if a breach is going to happen, it's when.
Exactly. And it's not just about having the right tech in place. It's about a company's culture.
Right. So it goes back to that privacy-ready organization.
Yes, making privacy a priority. Treating employees at all levels to understand their role in protecting data.
Like that old saying, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link.
Exactly. Everyone needs to be on board and have the knowledge and tools to protect that information. Now, the book also gets into some pretty complex ideas like personal information ecosystems. They call them mini PIEs for short.
Mini PIEs, okay.
It's a catchy name for something. We all have our own unique digital fingerprint made up of all the data that surrounds us. And it's not just the individual pieces of info like, your latest online purchase or that you Googled, um, best tacos near me at midnight.
Hey, a taco craving is a serious matter.
Exactly.
Right.
But it's the connections between those seemingly random data points that make these mini PIEs so valuable and potentially revealing. They paint a picture of our activities, online and offline, our relationships, our preferences,
Yeah.
even our beliefs.
So it's like a digital tapestry woven together by all these different threads of data.
That's a great way to put it. And the authors point out that as we use more digital services and devices, those tapestries are becoming incredibly intricate. And this has its advantages. It's what makes those personalized experiences possible, but it also makes privacy more challenging.
Right, because the more detailed and interconnected it gets, the harder it is to control how all those pieces are being used.
Exactly. The book pushes for a new way of thinking about privacy engineering to keep up with this complexity. It's not enough to just tack on some privacy measures as an afterthought.
It has to be part of the foundation from the start. Speaking of complex ideas, there's this one concept, competence without comprehension. Now that sounds kind of contradictory, doesn't it?
It does. They actually borrowed it from a philosopher, Daniel Dennett.
Oh, wow, okay.
And it refers to a system's ability to do something really well without actually understanding how it works. And they use this fascinating example of corn.
Corn, like the vegetable.
I know, right? But stick with me. Corn was selectively bred by Mexican farmers over thousands of years.
Right.
And they transformed this wild grass, teosinte, into the corn we know today, all without understanding genetics.
That's pretty incredible. Okay, I see where you're going with this.
It's like we're doing something similar with data, right? Companies collecting and analyzing these massive data sets using really complex algorithms, AI even, without fully grasping the ethical and societal implications of what they're creating.
We're building the plane while we're flying it.
In a way, yeah. And the authors highlight why learning about data privacy ourselves is so important.
We need to be informed.
Yes. Know our rights and demand better from those companies.
So it's not about all of us becoming like data scientists or anything.
No, it's about asking those questions, making informed choices about our data, and holding companies accountable.
It's about taking back some of that control. And that brings us to the book's big finish. It ends with this privacy manifesto that lays out a vision for the future, one where privacy and innovation can actually exist together.
They have these key principles they believe are crucial.
Let's hear them.
First up, building trust. It all comes back to trust. Companies need to go beyond those vague privacy policies. They need to be clear about what data they collect, how they're using it, who they share it with.
No more hiding behind confusing language.
Exactly. It's about being upfront and making it easy for users to access, correct, or even delete their data.
So giving users more control over their digital footprint. What else is on the list?
Minimizing data collection. It's about being intentional and only collecting what's absolutely necessary to provide that service.
It's like spring cleaning, but for data.
Exactly. The less data you collect, the less risk there is of something going wrong. The manifesto also talks about maximizing security.
Right, so that's a big one, making sure those security measures are top-notch.
And having a plan for when things go wrong, because they will, inevitably. And then there's transparency.
Transparency keeps coming up. It's clearly crucial.
It's about open communication, explaining things in plain language.
No more jargon-filled privacy policies.
Exactly. And finally, accountability. There needs to be a system in place to make sure companies are actually following the rules.
It can't just be like a slap on the wrist if they mess up. There have to be real consequences.
It's about moving away from blind trust and towards informed consent and shared responsibility.
I love that. So the book doesn't leave us doom and gloom. It ends with a call to action, encouraging all of us to work towards a more privacy-conscious future.
Exactly. Privacy isn't a lost cause, but it's going to take all of us individuals and organizations working together.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the big takeaways for our listeners? What do we want them to remember?
Data privacy is about our fundamental rights. It's about the kind of digital future we want to create.
It's about recognizing that our data has value, and it's up to us to understand how it's being used and demand better.
Be informed, be aware, make choices that align with your values.
This deep dive has given you a starting point. Now it's your turn to take that knowledge and become an active participant in your digital life.
Your data is valuable. Protect it.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Privacy Engineer's Manifesto. It's been fascinating. We'll see you next time as we continue to explore the ever-changing world of technology and what it means for us.